Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics, and in this video we are going to be reviewing the ZooMed 50-gallon lowboy. We've got a couple of them in our fish room. It's one of my favorite tanks, and it's a tank I will never buy again. If you want to know why, stay tuned. One of the things I like most about this tank are the dimensions. Being 48 inches long and 24 inches wide, you get a lot of surface area and a lot of space for your fish to kind of spread out in. And the fish generally like that horizontal swimming space more so than the vertical swimming space. So for us, if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know, again, we've got two of these lowboys. One is on the other side, and that houses our shellies, our Neolamprologus multifasciatus, otherwise known as the multi-shell dweller. And that is a perfect tank for those fish. They stay close to the bottom of the tank, they dig through the sand, and they spread out, but they don't use a lot of vertical space, so that 10 inches really isn't a factor. So that's a great option. The other one is right behind me, where we've got some apistogramma in that tank, some cory cats, and some mollies. And again, it's been a tank that works out really well. Now, when it comes to stocking options for this tank, I would try to figure that out first, because if you get that right, this can be a very rewarding tank. I mentioned on the other side, we've got the multis. If you've got shell dwellers, this would be a wonderful tank for shell dwellers that stay closer to the bottom. Or maybe you're thinking about breeding plecos of some type. Maybe you've got some smaller nano-type cichlids like apistogramma, rams, cribs. Those would all be a great type of fish for this tank. They're not going to use a lot of vertical space. They like to be closer to the ground, and therefore this is a really good potential option. Maybe you're into breeding shrimp. There's a lot of space here to breed shrimp, and again, they don't necessarily need the vertical space, so this would be a good tank option for them. I also think this would be a really cool tank for some of the rock-dwelling Lake Tanganyikan fish, such as Juliochromis. We've got some Juliochromis ornatus, some Transcriptus. Those are both really great fish to consider for this tank. Maybe some Leylupi, Neolamprologus Leylupi would be another one. So if you've got some rock-dwelling fish, this might be a really interesting setup. The other cool thing about this tank is the aquascaping options that you have. This tank lends itself especially well to an open top tank such as the one behind us, where maybe you've got some rocks or some driftwood that extend above the surface of the tank. Maybe you've created a little bit of an island. This can be a really cool tank for that. I also think that this tank makes a really cool center of the room tank. We have them on either side of our fish room, and I like it because it gives you a lot of footprint, 48 by 24, but with being only 10 inches high, you can see the rest of the room. So it really is a pretty cool focal point to the room, but it doesn't overwhelm the room so you can't see the other tanks. Now, once again, if you're going to consider a tank like this, there are some things to think about. One, these tanks will run anywhere from $100 to $150. At least in my experience, that's about the price range depending on where you buy them from and whether or not they are on sale. So it can be a little bit pricey for the volume. If you think about going and getting a 55-gallon to $1 per gallon sale, maybe you're spending like $60. So you might only be spending half the money for an equal size volume tank. The other thing you have to consider is the equipment. It's going to be a little bit harder to find equipment that fits really well with this tank. One of the big things are lids. Most fish will jump out of a tank if the tank is not covered. For this, there's no center brace on these tanks, so you really are trying to find something that's going to cover 48 by 24. We use polycarbonate on our multi-tank, and it works out really well. In fact, I did a video on how to use polycarbonate for fish tank lids. It saves a lot of money. I'll put that in the upper right-hand corner as well as in the description below. But I highly recommend something like that if you're going to buy a tank. At least keep it covered when you're not viewing the tank. The other thing that you have to think about is filtration. This tank presents some issues when it comes to filtration. There are multiple methods that you can utilize. We have used 3 different methods, actually 4 on these tanks. The first one, the multi-tank, has a couple of sponge filters. That's the only thing that was filtering that tank for a very long time. On this side, we've actually gone through 4 different filtration methods. One was a canister filter. I didn't really like that maintenance aspect of the canister filter, so I stopped maintaining it. And the second method that we used was basically filterless, where I just had an air stone in the tank for many, many months, and it worked out pretty well given the fact that we had a heavily planted tank that was well established, that didn't have extremely high stocking levels, so we never had any issues there. Not necessarily something I would recommend for the beginner. The next thing that we went to was an internal canister filter. That actually worked out fairly well, but we moved away from that just because we wanted something a little bit easier to maintain. And currently we have a Seachem Tidal 35 on that tank, a hang-on back filter that's working out pretty well. So you do have some options. I'm not sure any one option is great, especially if you're going to have the tank in the center of the room. And that brings up the next question is, how are you going to set up this tank for viewing? If you set it up properly, in my opinion, it's a really great tank. Ideally, at least in my opinion, to set this tank up properly, you want to have the tank high enough off the ground so that you can see when you're standing, you can look into the tank from the top view, but when you're sitting down, you can see the side view. Now, a disadvantage, of course, of this tank then is that your viewing panel is going to be relatively small. It's only 10 inches tall. Relative to other tanks like a 55 gallon, like a standard, that might be over 23 inches or so. I've already mentioned stocking options. This can actually be a disadvantage for this tank because you are limited. This is only a 10-inch tall tank, so larger fish are going to look really out of place in a tank like this. Any tall-bodied fish like angelfish or discus would never fit well into a tank like this. Even full-size gouramis look a little bit out of place in my opinion. And so you really have to make sure the fish you put in these tanks are relatively small. They're going to be active swimming in the horizontal space but not need too much vertical space. So for instance, this is not a tank I would ever add Mbuna to a tank like this, just because with only 10 inches of swimming space vertically, that's not quite enough for their active nature. You also have to consider your stand. Now this tank does happen to have the same dimensions as a 4'1" 120 or a 4'1" 150, so the stands are out there. For us, we decided to custom build both of our stands just because I wanted to have the correct height in both cases, and it worked out pretty well. So I started this video out saying that this is one of my favorite tanks and we will never buy another one. Why is that? It really has to do with the location within a room. I personally would not want to put this tank up against a wall for a couple reasons. One, I don't, in my personal opinion, I don't think it looks as nice. And two, the maintenance becomes a little bit more cumbersome when you have a tank that is 4 feet wide and 24 inches in width. So it's not something I'd want to put up against a corner of a room. It's not something I'd want to stack up against a wall. It's not really even something I would want to have multiple 50-gallon lowboys stacked up vertically, just because I think the greatest part about this tank is the viewing both from the top and all four sides. And so that's why, at least for us, we won't buy another one because I'm out of space in the fish room to put tanks in the center of a room. If I had another room and I had more open space, I might add one, but that's not the case. And so for us, we have two. I'm very happy with them. If you haven't had a chance to check them out, I highly recommend it. They are a very interesting tank. Would love to hear from you down in the comments section below. Do you have one? How do you feel about it? What kinds of fish are you putting in your 50-gallon lowboy? If you want more information on different pros and cons of different size tanks, check out this playlist in the upper right-hand corner. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.